In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in history. Most people had no idea what was happening. But behind closed doors, two superpowers were on the edge of total destruction: the United States and the Soviet Union. For 13 days, the fate of the entire world depended on decisions made in silence, pressure, and fear. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when civilization itself was seconds away from collapse. It all began when American intelligence discovered something unusual: Soviet missile installations in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These were not defensive weapons. They were nuclear-capable missiles, able to strike major cities in the United States within minutes. Washington was shocked. President John F. Kennedy was immediately informed, and what he saw changed everything. Because this was not just a military development, it was a direct shift in global power. The Soviet Union had moved nuclear weapons right next to American territory. The world had entered a new level of danger, a level where reaction time was no longer measured in hours but in minutes. The discovery of missiles in Cuba triggered immediate panic inside the U.S. government. Military advisors pushed for an airstrike. Others demanded a full invasion of Cuba. The logic was simple: if the missiles were destroyed quickly, the threat could be eliminated before they became operational. But there was a major risk. If the United States attacked Cuba directly, the Soviet Union could respond immediately in Europe, and that response could escalate into full nuclear war. President Kennedy faced one of the most dangerous decisions in modern history. Every option carried catastrophic risk. Meanwhile, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev believed the deployment in Cuba was a strategic necessity. The United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, close to Soviet borders. From Moscow's perspective, Cuba was a response, a way to balance power. But now both sides were locked in a situation where neither could retreat easily. Any mistake could trigger global destruction. The world, however, remained unaware. Life continued normally, while leaders were preparing for scenarios that could end humanity. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the American public. He announced that Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba, and he declared a naval blockade around the island. This was called a quarantine, a deliberate choice of wording to avoid immediate war. The world reacted instantly. Fear spread across continents. Markets became unstable. Military forces around the world went on high alert. The United States Navy began intercepting Soviet ships heading toward Cuba. Tension increased with every passing hour. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, the situation could escalate immediately into armed conflict. Behind the scenes, communication between Washington and Moscow became critical. Messages were exchanged slowly, carefully, and under extreme pressure. One wrong interpretation could mean war. At the same time, nuclear forces in both countries were placed on higher readiness levels. Bombers were loaded with nuclear weapons. Submarines carried missiles under the ocean, and radar systems scanned the skies constantly. The world had entered a silent countdown. As the crisis escalated, both sides began to realize how close they were to disaster. On October 24th, Soviet ships approached the American naval blockade. For a moment, it seemed inevitable that confrontation would occur. But then something unexpected happened. Several Soviet ships stopped before reaching the line. They turned around or slowed down. It was a small moment, but it prevented immediate escalation. Still, the situation remained extremely unstable. On the ground in Cuba, Soviet missile sites were being prepared rapidly. In the United States, military leaders continued to push for stronger action. Some even argued that waiting was too dangerous, but Kennedy resisted pressure. He believed that time and negotiation offered the only chance to avoid war. Meanwhile, secret diplomatic channels were opened. Messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev became the most important communication in the world. Each letter carried enormous weight. Every sentence could determine whether humanity survived or not. The tension was unlike anything ever recorded in modern history. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy. It proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. This was a possible breakthrough. But before the situation could stabilize, a second message arrived. It added another demand: the removal of American missiles from Turkey. This complicated negotiations further. Inside the U.S., government confusion increased. Some advisors wanted to accept only the first message. Others believed both demands had to be considered. Then, on October 27th, the situation became even more dangerous. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was killed. This incident brought both sides dangerously close to retaliation. Military leaders argued that the attack required immediate response. But Kennedy again chose restraint. He delayed retaliation and focused on diplomacy instead. It was one of the most critical decisions of the entire crisis. Unknown to the world at the time, something even more dangerous had already happened. A Soviet submarine near the American blockade was carrying a nuclear torpedo, and the crew believed they were under attack. Depth charges were being dropped nearby by U.S. naval forces. Inside the submarine, conditions were extreme. Heat, fear, confusion. The captain considered launching the nuclear torpedo. If that decision had been made, it could have triggered immediate nuclear escalation. But one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to agree. His decision prevented the launch, and possibly saved the world from nuclear war. This moment remained classified for years, and only later did historians fully understand how close the world came to destruction. At the same time, negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev continued under immense pressure. Every hour increased the risk of accidental escalation. The world was effectively waiting for a single mistake. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most important moments of the 20th century. It showed how close the world came to nuclear war, and how fragile global peace truly is. For 13 days, the future of humanity depended on decision-making under extreme pressure. There were no winners in this crisis, only survival. And lessons that shaped international politics for decades. The Cold War continued after 1962, but the rules had changed forever. Both sides now understood that direct nuclear confrontation was not just dangerous. It was unacceptable. And yet, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union would continue for decades more. But never again did the world come quite so close to ending itself. Finally, on October 28th, a resolution was reached. Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey at a later stage. Publicly, only the Cuban agreement was announced. The crisis began to de-escalate. Naval forces were withdrawn. Missile sites in Cuba were dismantled. And slowly, the immediate danger of nuclear war faded. But the world had changed permanently. Both superpowers now understood how fragile global stability truly was. A single miscalculation had brought humanity to the edge of extinction. After the crisis, communication between Washington and Moscow improved. A direct hotline was established to prevent future misunderstandings. Cuban Missile Crisis became a defining lesson in Cold War history.